Hello, my name is Jacob Kerr, and this is Stephen Archer, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2 in his book, The Mind and the Stock Market. Stephen, how are you doing today?
Just fine.
Just fine?
Yep. Better.
Better?
Yes.
So what changed? More blueberries or?
No, I was great yesterday, so I'm better today.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay.
Fair enough. So what's Chapter 2 about?
Well, the Chapter 2 just mentions that the investment process is there, but how does it arrive and how does it work, more or less. We agreed before that we're going to be talking about a broad array of investment alternatives, but we probably have to start by saying a little bit about saving. People who do save mean that they wish to transfer in time their spending. They want to spend later because they're going to go into retirement, or they want to buy a car, and that takes some saving. Can't do it all at once on this paycheck. Or they're saving to buy a house or a down payment on a house. So the savers then have the problem of what to do with those funds they save until they spend them. So that's where they have a large number of investment alternatives. Young people, of course, are looking forward to investing for a longer period of time than people who are nearing retirement, who are looking to spend the money and the savings that they already accumulated. So young people who look to investing wonder, where shall I put this money? Well, I'm giving up consumption now, I'm giving up spending now. At least I should be paid a little bit by somebody for the fact that I'm letting them use my money in the meantime while I'm waiting to spend mine sometime in the future. So you need to have then an idea about what you're going to do with your saving. If you put it into a bank savings account, that's a possibility. You get a certain rate of interest. Or you can buy CDs, certificates of deposit in a bank, and they may provide you a little more in a way of interest rate or return. But we call the rate of interest without any risk, without any inflation, that interest rate is called the pure interest rate. There's no risk involved, there's no inflation involved. They get their spending money 10 years from now or 20 years from now, and they're sure of it. We do have a pure interest rate, which is really what they're paying them for using that money during that period of time. So, in addition to the pure interest rate, of course, what you may pay or what you may get differs because of risk, inflation, and other things that contribute to determining the interest rate for a particular investment. One such way that many people usually save and invest is that they will put their money in a bank, a credit union, or other type of financial institution. We call these financial intermediaries because they collect savings from a large group of people, collect them and put them to work by lending them to somebody who wants to buy a house. And that person who buys the house has to pay a rate of interest on that mortgage. Now, therefore, we have an intermediary that collects funds and an intermediary invests funds. And this is quite true for a large part of our savings and investing process. The intermediary, like a bank, has a lot of demand for loans to business, loans to individuals, and so on, which they can charge a certain rate for. But they need to get a large amount of funds besides just what they have in terms of their own equity. So they pay a certain level of interest to individuals who create savings account with that bank. The bank then really operates and is functional by working on the difference between the rate of interest that they pay savers for savings account and the rate of interest they get from the mortgage person who is paying on borrowed money. So the bank then has a spread, as we call it, between the rate that they pay and the rate that they get. That spread they use for operations to pay for tellers and buildings and things like that, and equipment. So the financial intermediary plays a very important role in helping people who demand money and people who sell money or rent money, and they bring them together. Supply and demand for money then is met in the marketplace. The marketplace is really the financial intermediary in many cases. Now, I mentioned that in investing, younger people tend to invest for a longer period of time. I should mention that young people who are investing for longer periods of time can get the benefit of compounding. Compounding is a process in which the money that they invest earns money on the interest they accumulate. So if they put their money into a savings account and earn a nice rate of, say, 4%, then at the end of the first year, the bank pays them 4%. But if that person chooses to reinvest that 4% that it received, then he has $1.04 to invest for the second period, and $1.08 plus a few cents for the third period, and so on. So your compounding means you're paying that saver interest on the interest, and that accumulates and builds exponentially, we might say, so that after 20 years he has an extra, say, $40 that he wouldn't have had if he didn't leave his interest in there instead of taking it out and spending it. So young people have the advantage of compounding, leaving money in the bank, for example, and let it earn interest on the interest. That's just one example of investing that young people have. The people who are closer to retirement don't have much chance to compound the money that they have. So the savings come from many people. They come from corporations, they come from people abroad, and so on. And the investing are the banks, the stock market, bonds, stock, futures, options, real estate, all these alternatives on the investing side. On the savings side, we have individual personal savings. We have corporations which have money. They too are supplying the need for money. And the government itself does supply funds. Sometimes too much, and it causes inflation.
Yeah.
But they do. So you want to differentiate investing from speculation and gambling. Usually investing means that there is a calculated risk offsetting the return, and it's all a serious approach to earning your money on your money. Whereas, of course, speculation means that they're committing a certain amount of money, but they expect to make a quick gain. The speculators make sure that everything's in alignment. Namely, if somebody raises 100 bushels of corn and tries to sell it when he harvests it, he doesn't get a very good price because everybody is selling corn at that time. And there was a demand for corn later, say in January, that would get a really nice price for if he could save it. So speculators provide a means of buying up a crop, for example, at one point in time and holding it and reselling it at a time which there's a higher demand and a higher price. So speculators can provide a service. When you get to the study stock options, for example, you also will find out speculators will make sure that the relationship between a stock option and the stock itself does fit a proper order. And so speculators, if they see a gap in there, the erroneous relationship, then they in effect can buy and sell stock to do that. So speculators form a useful purpose in realigning commodities and investments into their particular proper relationship. Gambling, of course, means that you're playing a game in which you may know the odds or know the chances of gaining, but you do it for entertainment. And some people believe, of course, that they can, in many gambling situations, make money that way. But in all gambling situations, there has to be somebody who is running that gambling institution or that gambling setup. If it's horse racing, you got to have somebody maintain the track, somebody keeping track of all the bets and all of this. So they have to take a percentage off the wins and gains, or wins and losses. So usually any type of gambling, unless it's between you and your mother, are going to cause a gradual loss of funds, and it's not investing at all. So from here, when we'll move on towards then the array of investing primarily, aside from a few other topics to begin with.
Definitely a lot of information there. It's definitely very interesting how all these little factors add up to the big picture, and all these like little inputs can definitely lead to different outcomes and the outputs for why somebody should invest in X, Y, or Z.
Right.
Definitely depends on the environment, the age, what the inputs are, interest rates, etc., etc. But back to interest rates. So if interest rates go up, how does that affect the decision to buy a stock versus a bond?
Well, if you have a situation where there's no risk at all, and you just want to exchange money, we call that the pure rate of interest. It will be determined by the demand for money and the supply of money. If there's a lot of saving going on and so on and so forth, there's a lot of money flowing into various financial institutions, and it may push down the interest rate. But if there's a lot of demand for money, a lot of people want mortgage, corporations want to expand, and so forth, then they'll push up the interest rate. So it's a supply and demand in terms of, it's called the price of money. That's the interest rate. Now, most things are not entirely, of course, pure exchange of money over time. If there's an inflation involved, namely if you are setting aside money now as a saver and prices go up during the 20-year period you plan on saving, then you don't have any real gain because inflation has caused all prices to move up and take away your gain.
Yeah.
And so you really have to think about inflation when you talk about getting a return. Therefore, people who are supplying money will say, I'll get the pure rate of interest, but give me something to offset the inflation. So the inflation is built into the interest rate in various forms of exchange. The interest rate then for a person who's setting money aside for 20 years or 10 years or 5 years even, has to be paid for rising prices. So the pure interest rate, you add onto that a rate for inflation, and you add onto that a little bit a rate for risk, namely that the person who's supposed to pay you doesn't pay you and he dies or something. And therefore you have a whole range of rates. But the thing that tends to also influence the rate of interest and the whole schedule of interest for different types of needs and different people involved, in addition to being influenced by inflation and risk for the particular investment you're looking at, you have to consider that inflation is going to vary considerably. So we call inflation expectations are what determine the interest rate. Now, there is a body in a government which usually controls the banking and the price of money to some extent, or tries to, called a central bank. In the case of the United States, the Federal Reserve, in effect, tries to adjust the interest rate by buying and selling bonds and by charging banks higher rate for borrowing money. And so the central bank really is trying to control the amount of spending that takes place, trying to reduce the demand side by raising the cost of getting that money. So the United States, the Federal Reserve, then acts to try to ease the demand for money or increase the supply of money. Recently, in the recession of the 1910 to 1915, for example, we virtually had no recession because we had really had no inflation. So we had a recession period and there was nothing going on except that there was not enough demand for money and savers weren't getting paid very well. So the interest rate declined because the inflation expectations were very low, but also the Federal Reserve System was trying to pump money into the system in order for the banks to make more loans. And thus the central bank does try to behave in such a way as to influence the interest rate structure as a whole.
Yeah. So on a less book note, what makes Elon Musk so successful? He seems to understand the money aspect, the investing aspect, the inputs, outputs. He seems very savvy financially. So maybe he's read this book. Maybe he has read this book. So, what makes him so successful?
Well, he is a very wealthy entrepreneur with a lot of vision.
Yeah.
As to what things can be done. And he is spending his efforts then on trying to do those things that have not been done before. But he's a great visionary. He runs a space program.
Yeah.
He was into automobiles. He's into batteries. And it's amazing.
Yeah.
And everybody is surprised. And of course, the typical entrepreneur can't do that. He is looking for money.
Yeah, true.
And Elon Musk, of course, can also, because of all his assets that he has, also borrow money pretty reasonably.
True.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So I suppose you'd call him a rich entrepreneur with a lot of vision.
Fair enough. How does cryptocurrency play into this? In terms of just like the stock market, how does it affect stocks or interest rates or savings or bonds? Or does it affect it, or if it does, how does it affect it?
Well, interest rate changes certainly will affect the demand for money, up or down, and it also may affect the supply of money. Recently, in the recession, we were having a saving account with zero interest rates virtually, because the supply of money was sufficient that there wasn't enough demand to pick that up and use it for some particular purpose, hopefully constructive purpose, that the interest rate really never got off the ground. Interest rate and is perfectly related, of course, to bonds because they have to pay a certain level of interest to compete with stocks and other investment alternatives in real estate. So bonds have a certain rate, which we'd call a pure interest rate. They probably have to reflect, the interest rate has to reflect the inflation expectations, and it has to reflect the risk of the issuer of the bond. But a bond is issued at a certain point of time with a certain promise to pay through the whole life of the bond until it matures and is paid off. So if interest rates are changing after the bond has been issued, say the interest rates go up dramatically after the bond has been issued, that's going to make the old bond, which has already been issued, worth less because it's not paying as much as the current bonds are. So inflation then would tend to cause bond prices to fall.
Yeah.
And the other way around, bond prices can rise if the interest rates are decreasing, because outstanding bonds are paying a fixed rate all this time, but they get higher price for the fact that they're paying this level of interest, which is much higher than the new bonds that are being issued. Interest rates also react in the stock market because the stock market is competing for funds along with other investment alternatives. So the stock market says, well, if bondholders are receiving a 5% interest rate, we have to adjust the prices to some extent according to what the bonds are paying, and perhaps other investment alternatives likely. So there's some competition between investment alternatives. Stocks are pieces of ownership of the company, and they want to see that, of course, that they receive a fair rate of return in all circumstances. And consequently, as the economy changes and interest rate flow up and down, your stock market's going to also have an influence that may, for some of them, may for most of them, go up or down in the stock market. There's also a discussion about the interest rate curve, how that affects the economy. But I think that's a topic for much later discussion.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I definitely think that was some stellar analysis and value gave the viewers in terms of how to take into account all those things and make it into just one output. Like, how do you make a decision based off all these inputs, like a lever kind of?
That's right.
And definitely the Federal Reserve reminds me of a dam. Like, there's all that supply of money there, and as it helps with the interest rate going up and down, helps release a certain amount, so you don't have too much inflation or deflation possibly.
Yeah.
Federal Reserve kind of keeps a lever on how much is going in, so there's stability, it seems like.
See, the Federal Reserve can sell a lot of bonds in the marketplace and sell them in the banks and so on, and others are picking them up and buying them.
Yeah.
So that means if the bank is buying them, they have less loose cash lying around.
Yeah, true.
And they're holding bonds. Now, so that means if they have less loose cash, they're not so hungry to look for loans.
True.
And that kind of cools the economy. Now, if they want to go the other way around and not sell bonds to bank, but they want to buy bonds from the banks, then they're giving, when they buy bonds from the banks, they're giving the banks cash in exchange. And then the banks then look around where they're going to invest that. So, yeah, they can have a pretty good influence on investing, definitely.
Yeah. All right, fair enough. Well, thank you so much for the interview today. And we'll look forward to chapter 3 next time in The Mind in the Stock Market. Thank you.